Whenever we're trying to estimate the likelihood of simple events where the principle of indifference holds and we're able to determine the favorable and the total number of possible outcomes, then the classical interpretation works great. There are, of course, cases where we're not able to do that. And so here is Blaise Pascal, the guy who, together with Pierre de Fermat, created the basic structure of classical probability theory in that epistolary exchange. He's here to point out some of the cases that look very difficult for the classical interpretation. So suppose you want to calculate the probability that you're going to get lung cancer. Now, there are two possibilities. You do or you don't. I assume you don't is the favorable outcome. You apply the principle of indifference then, and you say, okay, there's one favorable outcome. There are two possible outcomes, 1 over 2, so I have a 0.5 chance of getting lung cancer. Of course, this is clearly false. You have a vanishingly small. It's not insignificant, but it's not a very large probability of developing lung cancer unless you're exposed to airborne carcinogens like smoking or a lot of really small particulates. And so unless you smoke or you get exposed to other airborne carcinogens or small particulates, you have a really low chance of getting cancer. Nature doesn't treat those two possibilities as equiprobable. The principle of indifference doesn't hold. So what should you do then? Well, the frequency interpretation, here articulated by the great mathematician Pierre Laplace, who made many contributions to probability theory, adopts a different approach. It says, look, if I can't determine favorable and unfavorable, if the principle of indifference doesn't hold, right, then I should make observations. Look at the real world, and I'll take my total number of observations, right, and I'll take my observations where it was favorable, and I'll divide the favorable by the total number, and that will give me an estimate of the probability for that event. Now, the textbook suggests that the relative frequency interpretation just equates the probability with observed favorable divided by the total number of observations, but that actually isn't the case. In general, frequency interpretations of probability think of probability as the frequency of favorable outcomes that you observe divided by the total number of observed outcomes as the total number of observed outcomes goes to infinity. In other words, the more observations you make, the closer you'll get to the actual number. And as a result, unless you've got an infinite number of observations, it's always an estimate of the likelihood. But what if you don't have access to data and the principle of indifference doesn't hold? Well, then you probably want to adopt the subjectivist interpretation. And this is the least desirable way of doing it, but it's a viable way of doing it. So, as Hurley notes, it's kind of weird to try and adopt a frequency interpretation of a particular unique one-time event, right? It's either 100% yes or 0% yes. And likewise, right, if I don't have time or the ability to collect data, it's going to prove to be impossible for me to use the frequency interpretation to estimate the likelihood of an event. And if I believe that the principle of indifference doesn't hold, then I'm going to have to estimate it some other way. And the way that the subjectivist interpretation suggests for us is that we use our understanding of the world, our knowledge of the world, to estimate the likelihood of that event. And it quantifies that in terms of the odds that a person would accept as a fair bet. So the idea here is that the probability of an event in the subjectivist interpretation isn't some real world thing, this fact about that event. No, it's your estimate. It's an epistemic notion of probability. It's based on your knowledge of the world and how you understand the world operate. And so as a result, right, it isn't intended to be an objective interpretation of probability. It's intended to be an estimate. Now, subjectivists like Frank Ramsey here would argue that this is an advantage. And in fact, they would say this is the primary appeal of the subjective notion of probability. It provides a ready connection, they say, between probability evidence and rational action. And it does so by asserting the probability is just what you would accept as fair odds. And so the subjectivist interpretation then supposes that you should estimate likelihood just using what you know about the world. And you can quantify that by interpreting that probability as the odds that you would accept as a fair bet. That is, the odds you would accept if you were going to make a bet over and over and over again, and you intended to break even in the long term. Okay? So the subjectivist interpretation then, different from the other two. And it's also, as we'll see when we get to the final module of our course there, the least reliable interpretation for estimating likelihoods of simple events in isolation. So it's the one you want to use the least and to avoid whenever possible. But sometimes you just have to use it.